In the tapestry of life, where every thread holds a story, America in black and white emerges as a haven for the voices echoing through the heart of our communities. In this podcast, we wade through the rivers of our collective experiences, celebrating the vibrant hues of change brought forth by the whispers of hope and the roars of action. It's more than just a conversation. It's a journey into the heart of our society, illuminated by the light of those daring to dream and do. Join us, and let your voice be the melody that guides us toward a dawn where every color finds its place in the masterpiece of our shared destiny. Together, let's paint a future brimming with the positives that dwell in our minds and the actions that shape our world.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of America in Black and White. I am your host, Charles King. I want you to sit with something for just a moment before we begin. Imagine living in a country where the way you love the person you love, the truth of who you are, is not just frowned upon, not just culturally stigmatized, but written into law as a criminal offense. Imagine that the state, the very institution built to protect you, has been handed the authority inherited from a colonial power that no longer even enforces these laws in its own country to arrest you, try you, and imprison you for up to 15 years for the crime of being yourself. Now imagine that you know this, that you carry this knowledge in your body every single day, and that you still wake up in the morning and choose to advocate, to recognize, to speak, to defend, to build, not because you are unafraid, but because the fear of staying silent is greater than the fear of speaking out. That is not a metaphor. For LGBTQ plus Zambians, and for LGBTQ plus Africans across the continent. That is a daily reality in 2026. Tonight's guest does not live in the comfort of abstraction. He lives in the complexity of consequence, and in that environment where HIV stigma continues to claim lives long before the virus itself reaches critical stage, where climate change is reshaping livelihoods on a continent that has contributed the least to the warming of this planet, where young people are being simultaneously left behind economically and locked out digitally in the middle of all that. He has chosen to stand up every single day. Here in America, we sometimes speak about Africa and the African continent as if it is a distant chapter in our story, as if the Middle Passage drew a line in the ocean that separated us into two different narratives. But it did not. The colonial systems that kidnapped African people and enslaved them on American soil are the same colonial systems that partitioned the African continent at the Berlin Conference in 1884, that extracted its resources, suppressed its languages, rewrote its history, and left behind borders designed to divide and laws designed to oppress. The wound is the same. The wound is the same wound. The struggle is the same struggle. And the resistance, the extraordinary unbroken line of Black resistance that runs from Frederick Douglass to Harriet Tubman to Fannie Lou Hamer to the freedom fighters of South Africa to the democracy organizers of West Africa to the human rights defenders of East and Central Africa, that resistance is the same resistance. Africa's sons and daughters have never stopped rising. Organizers, thinkers, builders, freedom fighters, people who looked at everything stacked against them and refused, absolutely refuse to let those systems have the final word. Tonight's guest is one of those people born on the soil of the continent that gave humanity its first breath. He carries that inheritance not as a burden, but as a mandate. What you're about to witness tonight is rare. This is not a conversation about Africa filtered through the lens of suffering, charity, or crises. This is a conversation about leadership, about innovation, about courage, about community, about what it looks like when a young Black man refuses to wait for permission to decide and decides instead to build the institution that his community needs. Tonight's episode is a window into the human rights landscape of sub-Saharan Africa that most people, even people who care deeply, have never had the privilege of seeing clearly. We're going to talk about HIV response and what genuine health equity requires when stigma and criminalization are working against treatment simultaneously. We are going to talk about LGBTQ plus rights and what advocacy looks like when the law is the adversary. We're going to talk about climate justice and why Africa's crises is the world's moral emergency. We're going to talk about digital justice and why internet access is not a luxury, but a human right. We're going to talk about economic empowerment and what it means to insist that Black communities be not just invited to development conversations, but resourced to lead them. And we're going to talk about youth leadership because all of this is being carried by a man in the prime of his youth who decided that the future could not wait. This is one of the most important conversations we have had on this show, and I am honored that you are here for it. Tonight's guest is a human rights advocate, an LGBTQ plus rights defender, a climate justice activist, and a social entrepreneur whose work is reshaping what is possible for marginalized communities in Zambia and across the African continent. He is the co-founder and executive director of Access Horizons Initiative, a youth-led organization working at the bold and necessary intersection of human rights, public health, digital justice, economic empowerment, and climate resilience. His life's work is a refusal, a daily deliberate, courageous refusal to accept that the communities he serves should have to choose between their identity and their safety, between their health and their dignity, between survival today and justice tomorrow. He is joining us tonight from the continent that is the cradle of all humanity, and he is brilliant, and he is brave, and he is here. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to America in Black and White, the extraordinary Benjamin Hyson Mutambo. Welcome to the show, sir.
Hello, hello. How you doing?
I'm doing just excellent. How are you?
I'm lovely. Lovely. Good morning. I don't know if it's good morning, good evening. What are we doing? Good evening.
So, is there anything you'd like to say to the audience before we get into the show?
Sure. I'm so excited for this platform. I feel like this is one of the rare platforms. I mean, we don't get such opportunities, especially down south here in Southern Africa, in Zambia, to actually be able to speak freely, because we always feel many a time our voices are controlled. Our voices are usually scrutinized whenever we get to speak about it in the public space, being the Zambian eye of this public space. But being offered an international platform like this to actually have conversations which we're going to have, it excites me, because I mean, it's going to be raw, it's going to be exciting, and one thing is going to be honest. So thank you so much for having me on this platform, and I look forward for any questions that you may have with regards to my context, living here in Zambia, in Africa, being an LGBT plus person, LGBTQ plus person living in Zambia and Africa. So thank you so much. So I'll give it back to you.
Yes, well, we welcome you, and I want to thank you for being here. I also want to thank all of our audience for watching. That is those that are no matter where you are. I appreciate you as well as all of our normal supporters that are here. We appreciate you so much, and I hope you guys enjoy this show like you do the others. So, what I want to do first, Ben, is I want to start with where I get the audience let the audience have an opportunity to get to know a lot about you and who you are before we get into all of the great things that you're doing. And I want to start this off, and I call this "The Man from Zambia: Life Story and Origins."
Okay.
So, so with this, I want you to start at the very beginning, not the organization, not the advocacy work, not the titles and expertise, just the boy. Where did you grow up in Zambia? What was your world like? What did your childhood teach you about what is right, what is wrong, and what is worth fighting for?
Okay. I mean, that's a very interesting question. I think I'm gonna tackle it this way. So I grew up in Zambia, of course, like you've mentioned. I was born in Chipata, Zambia, which is on the eastern province of the country. Beautiful place, by the way. But I don't recommend being growing up there being black, gay, and economically disempowered. Um, it's a very, very tricky situation in the sense of where when you grow up in a very staunch religious family, you get to live your life based off their perception. So I grew up in a way that I wouldn't call it in a horrible way, but I grew up in a beautiful way from an amazing family, very loving family. But at some point, I needed to recognize who I was and what I stood for. But that was so difficult because at the end of the day, we always have this running joke amongst my circle of friends to say, "Don't be black, gay, and poor. Don't be, don't be." I shit you not, because those intersectional lies will literally screw up your life at the end of the day. Because at the end of the day, being marginalized on all fronts will do you such a disadvantage on your life that you end up feeling as if your life amounts to nothing. So, what I'm trying to say basically is that I grew up in a loving home. Yes, great. As I grew older, I realized I came into my own pretty much, and I started to realize that this is who I was, and this is who I should not be. And at the end of the day, I decided to think to myself that how do I come out with my family? That was a difficult situation. Already the law is against us. That's for one. The law is against us. My family is against that best of the religious practice and the doctrine that they believe in. So it was a very interesting time growing up, and I believe that I really don't know how I got through it, hey? Because I think if I remember correctly, it was a thing of just pretty much just pushing forward, waiting for a moment when I actually got my economic independence, where I could actually just say, you know what, this is who I am, and this is what I'm gonna do with the rest of my life. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. Um, a couple of years ago, I had a weirdly disturbing experience where someone who I thought was a close friend of mine decided to out me to my family. And at the time, I was being economically supported by my family. And that led to my family withdrawing the economic support from me. And subsequently, I was taken into conversion therapy, and the rest is history. I will not delve down too much into that because at the end of the day, we don't wanna give the audience an emotional roller coaster ride. You know what I mean? But what I will say is that it was an interesting time growing up in Zambia, especially witnessing queer people like myself, witnessing the law being weaponized against us politically, socially, religiously, culturally. I think one of the things that interests me the most about living in Zambia is that the law itself doesn't have a leg to stand on. Culture itself doesn't have a leg to stand on. Religion itself doesn't have a leg to stand on because at the end of the day, everything is in conflict with each other. So now you start to wonder to yourself, thinking that at what point do these ideologies reach an intersectional aspect to say, When do we recognize humanism? When do you recognize humanity? When do we recognize empathy in order to accommodate certain members of our community without leaving anyone else behind? And which is strange. We've got so many freedoms in my country. I mean, same like the US, we've got so many freedoms in my country. But the difference is certain freedoms in my country contradict each other. Certain cultural freedoms contradict each other. There's certain cultural practices which are allowed by law, allowed by society, allowed by culture. But it's strange to say. It's strange to think that there's a huge bias and there's a huge bigotry around that, surrounding all that ideologies. In the sense that certain ideologies are accepted culturally and certain ideologies are not accepted culturally. Living as a gay man, living as a lesbian woman, living as a trans person in Zambia is frowned upon legally, socially, culturally, religiously. But it makes you wonder to say, why are certain aspects of our social living, our cultural living, also scrutinized in the way that LGBTQ plus persons are living their lives? I will talk about things like, for example, things that are basic things that are in our constitution: theft, murder. We'll look at things like infidelity, and so on and so forth. These things are not scrutinized in the way that the individual living, the individual context of who someone is scrutinized. And it's so shocking to find out, to realize and grow up in this country to find out that politicians actually weaponize the ignorance of the masses to gain votes from the populace, pretty much weaponizing downtrodden people, using their economic disadvantagedness, using that, for example, using the level of education, using the level of misinformedness. And Zambia is one of the few places in Africa which actually has used religion and constitutionalized religion, brought it into the constitution, and now you find government leaders, politicians have actually now started to use weaponized religion in order to suppress voices. We're going to be having an election, on the 13th of August this year, and so far so good. But I've been worried in the past, especially in the 2021 elections, where public speakers, politicians who are aspiring for the presidency have used LGBTQ people for the purpose of securing votes amongst the conservatives. So, yeah, that's a little bit about myself.
So, Zambia is a country of extraordinary complexity, a
Yeah.
nation that gained its independence in 1964 that has navigated colonialism's aftermath, HIV climate pressures, and economic inequalities. So, hold on one second here, please. And so, with that, and with the most courageous voices, growing up there, what did it feel like to be a young person watching your country navigate all of that? And when did you understand that you were going to be someone who tried to change something?
Okay. Growing up in Zambia, like I mentioned, we're being bombarded with truths of, for example, our founder Kenneth Kaunda, our truth of humanism, patriotism, of empathy. I mean, Zambia's fight for independence was one of tragedy where a lot of lives were lost. That was way before my time, of course. But growing up in Zambia, we grew up with these stories, these fundamental stories of freedom fighters, the humanism that they preached, the empathy that they preached around culture and tribe. Because Zambia is one country which has not necessarily healed from tribalism and ethnic. The ethnic diversity that exists in Zambia, because Zambia is a country with 72 tribes, and this is one thing that our founder actually preached: one Zambia, one nation. But I don't think at any point they say one Zambia, one nation minus the LGBTQ people. Um, but it's so strange that growing up in Zambia, we started to realize that by we, I mean my community, and other people who are marginalized, people living with disabilities, people who are people who are differently abled. I apologize. We started to realize that one Zambia, one nation doesn't necessarily mean being included into the whole holistic nature of what the country preaches about one Zambia, one nation. We do understand that there's legislature around that. We do understand and appreciate that legislature surrounds the whole systematic um, running of the country. But at what point do we actually start to interrogate who someone is, who someone should be, and what one Zambia, one nation should be? Because at the end of the day, someone being gay, lesbian, trans, queer, bisexual, whatnot, doesn't make them any less Zambian. And growing up in Zambia, I grew up in the age of social media. You get sentiments on social media saying things like, oh, you're this, you're that, you're queer, you're gay, you're lesbian, and you're whatever. How about you leave the country and be gay or lesbian or trans elsewhere? Which is very strange. This is not the humanity. This is not the humanism that Kenneth Kaunda preached. Because at the end of the day, when you say one Zambia, one nation, everyone is included in that mantra, no? But that's not a mantra we're living by. We're living by a religious construct, a culture construct that many of us don't actually understand. And a lot of the time, there's a whirlwind which is being pushed by anti-right movements, which a few politicians sit around that who push the agenda of anti-rights in the country, anti-human rights, anti-LGBTQ rights towards the masses. And it's so unfortunate that the masses are not as informed that they should be, and they carry that information with them, and before we know it, they radicalize that information. And living in a black majority country is one of the I would say this in as brutally honestly as I can. Being black gay in Zambia is hard because not only are you in a black majority country which lacks the diversity that a Western society should have to accommodate divergent views, because most of our views in Zambia are homogeneous. Conservativeness, being religious, being humble, as most political aspirants like to call it, being of the faith. So growing up in Zambia felt like a chore, pretty much. It felt like you need to live each and every day fighting for your life internally within yourself, wondering at what point will I be found out, at what point will I be caught out, and what happens to me when I get caught out, what happens to me when I get found out. Our penal code does not necessarily vindicate or legislate against homosexual relationships, being the identity of being gay, the identity of being lesbian, the identity of being trans. Our penal code does not legislate against that. What our penal code does legislate against that is what they call the unnatural act of same sex sex, pretty much. But it's so strange that even through the legislature, through political aspirants, through your councillors and your political leaders, no one ever bothers to educate the masses on what the law actually prescribes as a crime. So you live your life thinking that Ben, am criminal, pretty much. So now, at what point, as Ben is growing up, 13, 14 years, 15, 16 years old, who understands very little of the law, does someone come to me or someone publicize the fact that my existence is not a crime? I will touch on the fact that later on, of course, as we continue this conversation, to say same-sex relations is under the penal code, but the identity of belonging to a certain sexual minority is not a crime. But that's one distinction that a majority of our populace in Zambia fails to understand. You would find sentiments from people saying people who are queer, lesbian, gay, and whatnot, LGBTQ, should be arrested based off their identity. And then I wonder to myself, um, through each and every step of civic education that every single Zambian has gone through, at what point was this information relayed to them saying identity is not a crime? It's the same sex relations that is a crime, which is also a very, how can I put it? It's also a very, I remember you had mentioned earlier on to say these are laws that we inherited from the British Empire at the time when Zambia and Northern Rhodesia at the time was a colony of the British Empire. We inherited those laws. Meanwhile, our colonial masters have revised those laws and have adopted new laws to accommodate the growing diversity in their nations. Meanwhile, we've kept those laws and regulations and the principles and the cultural nuances and so on. So, in a nutshell, growing up in Zambia was it was a steep climb.
Well,
It was a steep climb.
what I
Go
was
on
just
now.
listening is that it sounds like about a lot that what happens here in the U.S. as well, and that is, for whatever reasons, in using the Bible as you say. I mean, now that's one of the things that these politicians do, but that's not written into what they do into the Constitution, whatever have you. Even though it says clearly that you're supposed to separate church and state, but some
Mm.
people use that anyway, and it's like it's this crying wolf thing when it comes to that. Now, what it sounds like to me, and it seems like a little bit of a comparison, because some of the things that you were mentioning before, like the conversion therapy and all those other things, that has happened here in some places here in the US. It still happens. Now,
Mhm.
what I would always think, and we're not going to bring religion into this, but I do want to say this, is that if those folk actually read the Bible, then I think they would know that they're committing the very sin against the Bible in which the Bible speaks. But
That is that is so true. That
but
is so true. I guess maybe we, and I'm gonna use the word we very loosely in the sense of where like we feel like we've got a God given mandate to carry out the rules and legislation and the laws of God. And it's very, very unfair in the sense of where we place ourselves at the center of judgment and being the carriers and the executioners of the law. Meanwhile, if someone is as religious and at Christ-like as they would like to think they are, why would you be the executioner and the judge and executioner of the laws of God? But anyway, like we said, we'll live religion for later on, possibly, because that's a very, how can I put it? It's a very touchy conversation for a lot of black folk like us, and you know what I mean? Because at the end of the day, a lot of black folk really use religion as a foundation and a stepping stone for who they are, who they're gonna be, and who they should be.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. So your human rights advocacy, especially for the LGBTQ plus rights defense in a country where the law itself is used as a weapon against queer people, is not just professionally risky; it can be personally dangerous. When did you first know that this was your path? And was there a moment, a person, an experience that crystallized your commitment to this work?
Oh, of course, of course, of course. I mean, apart from my conversion therapy itself, I already knew who I was at the time. I already, even prior to, I already knew who I was. But I've had a couple of incidences where I step out of my home and go into public spaces, and maybe based off how I'm interacting with certain people, I've experienced violence around that, verbal violence. I've experienced someone pushing and pulling me around, telling me that, well, in vernac, of course, telling me that people like me shouldn't exist and we should be murdered. You know what I mean? So I think incidences like that have actually helped me, actually given me the strength to say, we shouldn't live like this. But It's hard being an advocate in Zambia because, in as much as certain incidences like that have happened to you, but who do you actually channel the advocacy to? Because the government is against you, the society is against you, the
Mhm.
culture is against you.
Yep.
So, I mean, in as much as you're advocating for that, the advocacy comes from a place of where, even if I'm advocating to the person next to me, I'm going to do it from a point of empathy, not from a point of legislature, because they'll not know what I'm talking about. So, I guess to answer your question, I knew that this was my path when I'd experienced all these different things in my life: verbal violence, physical violence, and also the conversion therapy. I knew this was my path because I felt that no one needs to live, no one deserves to live like this. No one deserves to be victimized for the rest of their lives based off who they are. It's very strange to say when people always think that being queer, being LGBTQ is something that you can wake up one morning and say like, oh, okay, I'm not gonna be gay anymore. You know what I mean? But then the opposite is also true. Like, okay, but in a country like Zambia, who would want to wake up in a country like Zambia and think like, okay, I'm gonna wake up gay or lesbian today and continue to be victimized? You know what I mean? Who would choose victimization out of peace and comfort that comes with assimilating and pretty much just conforming to the culture and society of what my country provides? Yeah.
So let's get a little bit more deeper into your advocacy work. And this part I want to talk more about the LGBTQ rights, the advocacy in Zambia, your courage under law. For our audience who may not know, let's be clear about the legal landscape. Same-sex relations in Zambia are criminalized under colonial penal code, carrying penalties up to 15 years in prison. You're an LGBTQ rights defender operating in that environment. I want you to help us to understand, what does it actually feel like to do this work in this country with this law on the books, not abstractly, but what does it feel like in your body, in your daily fire?
Oh, that's a doozy, hey? Okay, so I will say, when it comes to advocacy, right, we have an understanding with the principal lawmakers, as we like to call them, to say, in as whatever realm or whatever sector of advocacy that we're doing, whether it's health rights, economic empowerment, climate justice, we have an understanding, an unwritten understanding, an unwritten hearing to say we will not call it that. We would call it, I remember this just changed recently, the term just changed recently. We used to call it key populations. Key populations pretty much was female sex workers, people who inject drugs, men who have sex with men, prisoners, and so on and so forth. So the term just recently changed, and now they're calling us marginalized people, marginalized communities, or whatever the public health term is now these days. So pretty much now, advocacy for us every single day of our lives is not really advocacy to say we're advocating for LGBTQ rights. We've masked the idea of LGBTQ rights under the umbrella of human rights, pretty much. In as much as we've got an HIV pandemic in Zambia here, when our first interventions around HIV in Zambia started, we masked it under public health rights, which the government was very much aware of this. The government has always been aware of the work that advocates, human rights defenders are doing in Zambia with regards to LGBTQ rights. We've always been aware. But the thing is that society is not aware of that. So whenever we caught out to say a certain safe space or wellness center exists in a certain community, and then one, two, three, four, five people on social media feel as if the government is in support of LGBTQ rights service provision, the government is aware. And the thing is that because everything is under the guise of public health, universal access to human rights, which our government conforms to. So every single day is a journey because we don't know exactly at what point in time when the tides will change for, because now our our LGBTQ rights advocacy, which I mentioned earlier on to say is now under the guise of human rights, will now become a pariah topic because our society has got a habit of nitpicking which parts of the broader human rights should be and should not be allowed. So I guess on a day-to-day basis, it's hard because there's a lot of safety and security concerns which we need to, of course, be aware of. You need to be aware of your language. You need to be aware of your verbatim. You need to be aware of who you say it to, what you say, how you tell her the message, and for how long the message should go on for. So, I mean, the fact that a lot of our health system is supported, was supported by PEPFAR initiatives, which were USA, formerly USAID, CDC, and so on and so forth. I guess it helped a lot the fact that through these initiatives, LGBTQ rights were being advocated silently through public health. And it's unfortunate right now because of a lot of funding cuts, a lot of reinfections are now going on around in our communities, and a lot of human rights advocacy has been lost because that was our shield. That was our shield. We could advocate for human rights. We could advocate for LGBTQ rights using the shield of no, we're carrying out a USAID mission initiative project. We're carrying out a CDC initiative project, but now it's become increasingly difficult, especially that if one organization partners internationally with, I'll give you an example. Imagine a local civil society organization in Zambia partnering with organizations such as um, Gay Rights Initiative Global. You know what I mean? That sends that sends a radical message already locally, and no bank wants to touch you once they see that you're receiving funding from people like that, because at the end of the day they feel as if um, your initiatives are being pushed by the West. You get what I mean? Like the entirety of your initiatives, the entirety of your programming, the entirety of your strategic interventions is a Western agenda, pretty much. I mean, it's funny because every single day there's always some, most, not really every single day, but most days there's always someone who's always thinking to themselves and maybe pointing fingers to say our advocacy is a Western agenda. And I always think to myself, like, okay, but are you saying even the existence of queer people, LGBTQ people in Zambia and Africa as a whole is a Western agenda? Are these plans, are these CIA plans who are here to destabilize the democracy, the Christian values of Africa and Black Zambia and conservative Zambia? You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so basically, it sounds like, and you tell me if this is right, but it sounds like what you're saying is that they do allow you guys your advocacy work and maybe to do a protest, but they want to make sure that it's a controlled fight in the advocacy and not like one that's really big and broad that draws an enormous amount of attention, because the more attention that you draw, then that means the more the spotlight is on you, and the government is not going to have that. Is that what that is?
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. So you're given this much of a platform to actually not necessarily advocate for LGBTQ rights, but then you're given that much of a platform to say, okay, you can, in as much as you're designing programs for universal human rights, you can include X amount of people in your programming, and we're gonna give it a ribbon and a, a little red ribbon and tie it on it and say, instead of calling it LGBTQ rights, can we call it can we give it a public health term like men who have sex with men,
Mhm.
things like that. They will never ever allow you to say LGBTQ in any single space. And Actually, the government policy is actually something that's very, it's very neither here or there, because at the end of the day, whichever presidential aspirant comes into power in that particular moment in time, they'll either diminish LGBTQ rights or they'll silently support it. And when I say silently support it, I mean they'll not say anything at all. Not to say that they'll go behind closed doors and have conversations around this. They will not say anything at all. So we usually take that little sliver of not saying anything at all as some sort of support, because we like to think silence
Mhm.
means you're in support of, right?
Mhm.
But then we're always in a difficult situation to think that, okay, LGBTQ rights in Zambia, LGBTQ rights in Africa. Okay, we understand that LGBTQ rights in Zambia and Africa do not start here or end there. They are they're ongoing.
So you're saying
But
that they
then,
basically connect everything to the continent as one thing instead of separate for each country.
well, not necessarily. I mean, like Zambia's constitutionally is a Christian nation, right? I mean, Zambia is only constitutional Christian nation in Africa. So there's another layer towards that.
Mhm.
There's another layer towards that. I mean, there's the Africanism at the end of the day. There's the black consciousness at the end of the day to say like, okay, we as black people do not believe in homosexuality. But then there's also the aspect of Zambia as a Christian nation, and now Zambia is a signatory to several human rights and several health acts globally. So now it's always a thing of where how does how does the government, how do we as activists, how do we as civil society organizations tie everything together in the sense of where like, okay, without taking the fact that Zambia is a Christian nation away from the country itself, but how do we also reach a point of neutrality to say we can still provide this service to A, B, C, D, but still maintain the fact that, okay, we understand that this is a constitutional declaration and this will not be going away anytime soon. It's an interesting conversation. It's a very interesting dynamic once you're on the ground, I promise you.
So,
Yeah.
so tell us, like with all the advocacy work that you're doing and all of the barriers that you face, tell us how does that these things come back to affect you and the people that you advocate for? How does that show up?
I mean, that shows up I mean, at the end of the day, it shows up in so many different aspects: mental health, the rise in HIV cases, the rise in IPV, intimate partner violence, the rise in domestic violence cases, and things like that. And also, just to add another layer to what you've just asked just right now, one of the biggest barriers towards advocacy is resources. I mean, without resources, there's only so much that you can do. I mean, Zambia is such a massive country in the sense of where you cannot just do advocacy in the urban areas. You need to translate that advocacy into rural areas, into the most untouched areas of the country. But now the fact that there's a lot of barriers around culture, there's a lot of religious barriers, societal barriers that exist around that. So, how it translates back to us is that it always feels as if it's a drawback. You can make you can reach 15, 20,000 people in HIV care and human rights service provision and so on and so forth, mental health service provision, sorry. But then before you know it, 2 or 3 weeks from now, there's a policy change, or maybe there's a funding cut, and now you're back to square one. So many people get lost to care, HIV care. Certain people get lost to care towards mental health service provision, and then several people also get lost to the fact that the certain interventions that were specifically designed for cultural sensitization, so sexual sensitization, but without the resources, it always feels as if it's 2 steps forward, 100 steps backwards. Yeah.
So the laws criminalizing LGBTQ plus identities across much of Africa are not ancient African traditions. They are colonial inheritance, British penal codes imposed on African societies that, in many cases, had for more fluid and
Mm-hmm.
inclusive understandings of gender and sexuality before
Yeah,
colonialization. So, how do you
yeah.
use that historical truth in your advocacy, and how do people respond when they hear it?
Um, that's a very interesting question, actually. I guess maybe what I would say is that history always teaches that society grows through dialogue. I mean, we always have dialogues. We try as not as much as possible to have dialogues within the confines of what we're allowed to do, because remember, it's a closed loop. You can only say as much as the state is allowing you to say, without making yourself become a victim towards the law. So my hope is that Zambia continues to have the conversations, in as much as we're having the conversations through a closed loop, and we are having conversations in the realms of dignity, regardless of who's got different beliefs and whatnot. Um, I will say this: one of the biggest undocumented factors in our country is that we never ever realized to say LGBTQ rights existed in our country prior to colonial rule, prior to, I would like to call it, colonial indoctrination.
That's a great way of saying it because that's putting their culture on you.
Yeah, these things existed in our country way before that, and these are things that undocumented. I mean, I have sat with certain traditional leaders in my country who've said these things exist in our communities. They've always existed, but it's just that we don't talk about them. It was only after those policy that was introduced, now we have to talk about them. And now we have to publicly shun away from them. You know what I mean? Because at the end of the day, these were unspoken conversations that existed in our black communities. But now, come legislation, come policy, come colonialization, now all these things were put in the spotlight, and now we had to talk about them. We had to identify them and actually shun them away and actually develop legislature against them,
Yes.
which is exactly. So she's one of the things that Zambia has always historically approached these things in a very subtle way, very, very subtle way. Only until certain radical aspects within the institution, within the machine come into play, do these things actually come into the spotlight of conversation. And many a time, this conversation is usually against our people, against my people, without regarding the fact that these are actually real human beings, real opportunities that they have, real livelihoods, real families. Can I just add one more thing? Sorry.
Yes.
Um, there's always there's always this idea that queer people in Zambia, LGBTQ, whichever letter on the spectrum one belongs to, there's always this idea in Zambia that people live in isolation. You know what I mean? People always forget that person A, person B has got actually a family behind them who are okay with who they are. But the general perception of our country and our continent is that people see us and they feel as if a gay man lives in isolation, a lesbian woman lives in isolation without a parent, without a sibling, without an uncle, without an aunt, and whatnot, which is a very, very unfair perception that we have. So I guess getting back to your question, one of the conversations that we try to have with our communities is to make people realize is that we don't live in isolation. We actually have parents, we have siblings, we have a brother, we have a sister, we have a mother who actually know about us and are okay with it. So I guess at a certain extent, once you can convince the next person to say that this person who is marginalized in society actually has a family structure around them. They've got friends and they've got family who are okay with their identity. Now, how do we translate that being okay about the next person nationally? How do we translate it provincially? How do we translate it culturally? How do we translate it nationally?
So
Back to you.
but with all that, I mean, because I can tell that you're putting forth the effort in the work that you're doing. But can you tell us
Yeah,
how is it that with them not allowing you to say LGBTQ or gay or things of this nature when
yeah.
you're actually doing your advocating, how do you, how do you identify as being who you are when you're doing this advocacy work without being able to use those words?
I mean, at the end of the day, I personally would never ever identify myself publicly unless maybe I'm asked by a certain close friend or family.
Okay, okay.
But at the end of the day, we have vernacular nuances that we usually use to actually say to actually help us identify certain people within communities. But these are terms which, and this is a very interesting thing about vernacular, because it can neither mean this or that. It's never really a straightforward response. You know what I mean? Because at the end of the day, one figurative term can actually mean this or that. So, but I mean, based off how you're phrasing that particular question, the person who you're phrasing it towards will actually be able to understand what you're talking about and who you're referring to. But because you're you're using vernacular to actually address certain terms within our society, somehow it's been okayed. But now, when you translate LGBTQ into the English definition as you and I know it, it becomes a social offense now, which is,
Oh wow.
yeah, interesting.
Yeah, that is you know I tell you, you know, I can say that what most likely what the leaders of your country are saying is that we're not discriminating because we've got advocacy, we have people out doing whatever they do for their rights. But
Yeah,
but in the back doors, in the back rooms, it's like you're not going to
no,
use that term. If you use that term,
no,
that's offensive, and you are going to go to jail. That's the threat.
exactly, exactly. Exactly, and I love what you just said. Like I remember, it should have been a couple of years ago when we had a women's match in Zambia, a beautiful women's match in Zambia, and of course the community came out in number to support the women, and then of course the community came out in the rainbow flags and trying to show solidarity for women's rights and also trying to show solidarity for themselves. A couple of people actually picked up with the police for the fact that now social media sensationalized the fact that all people came up to this event and now they're showing the LGBTQ and the rainbow flag and things like that. So people were actually arrested for
Oh
that. And
wow.
now, yeah, it's very interesting. Hey, we live in interesting times. And now you start to wonder to yourself to say like, okay, what law are you using to actually arrest this person? You know what I mean? Like, what is the legislative backing that you're actually using to apprehend this person and actually um, put them behind bars days on end without a trial, without any conviction, without like it doesn't make sense, you know? And that's like I'm always say that usually things like this always come from a political directive. They always come from a societal directive. Someone somewhere is not happy about advocacy, about a certain way that advocacy was happened, and now they feel as if this is gonna hamper their political aspirations. So it's interesting, I would say. But anyway, we are always trying to figure out ways of how, not as much as we're advocating for LGBTQ, right? We're always trying to figure out ways on how we can actually advocate for this without necessarily advocating for it, if you know what I mean.
Right.
In a way, silent advocacy. Can we have these conversations without actually necessarily having to talk about them, but at the same time realizing that you and I both know that this exists, but can we talk about it without actually talking about it?
Yes.
You get what I mean?
That's the code.
Yeah,
That's the coded language. You just get the
exactly.
read for the body language and the gestures and the things of that
Exactly.
nature. So that's how you move in silence.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a very, it's one of those things. which at the end of the day, we always think to ourselves that will it get better? N- Not right now. Is it gonna get any worse? Depends who's in power. I mean, look at it this way. Just a few years ago, I think that should have been, if I remember the years quite correctly, 2021, 2022. We had a US ambassador by our late president, Edgar Lungu, who was ousted from the country because that should have been Ambassador Foot, last name Foot, who was ousted from the country because he felt that the apprehension of two gay men who were caught in the act and were sentenced to a 15 years prison sentence. And he spoke against that. And then the president at the time felt that this is something that was not the business of the State Department, the US ambassador, and whatnot. And then before we knew it, this ambassador was kicked out of the country. So it's always things like this because at the end of the day, when I think about it critically like that, I don't think Ambassador Foot was kicked out of the country based off his radical views, but because of how his views would actually sensationalize the Zambian community, the Zambian society, pretty much. Yeah. Mm.
So, the LGBTQ plus community in Zambia does not exist in isolation. Its members are also young people, women, HIV positive individuals, climate vulnerable community members, people navigating poverty and exclusion in multiple dimensions at once. Can you tell us how does that intersectionality shape how you design programs and advocacy through Access Horizons initiative, and what does it mean to serve someone at the intersection of multiple forms of marginalization simultaneously?
Okay, that's a very interesting question, actually. Um, Usually when interventions are designed, we designed with people in mind. Um, a lot of the time, because most of our work is donor supported, most of our work is donor funded and partner affiliated. So you would find that certain interventions only speak to certain target groups. The intersectionalities only exist where the resources allow it to exist, if I was to say that. Because at the end of the day, we do have a lot of cross transmission between several communities in our country. But then you might find that a certain donor will only expect you to design programs and interventions, for example, towards men who have sex with men. They will not want you to touch target groups like female sex workers and people who use drugs and things like that. And then they'll leave those target groups to another partner, another affiliate who will take up the mantle of providing services to those communities. So the intersectionalities usually occur when Access Horizons is able to speak to another civil society organization to actually be able to understand or co-design programs or co-implement projects to actually figure out, okay, if civil society A is designing interventions around this target group, and my civil society organization is designing interventions against another target groups. How do we come together to actually make sure that the two communities, there's no cross transmission, especially around HIV, and also how can we come together in the sense of where um, how can we come together in the sense of where there's certain marginalizations that happen between several segments of our communities are not all occurring at once. I'll give an example. A lesbian woman who's a sex worker who uses drugs, who might be a prisoner.
Oh, wow.
I think it's a very interesting dynamic in the sense of where actually it also applies to men who have sex with men, gay men. You can be a gay man. You use drugs. Maybe you're HIV positive. You're a person living with HIV at the end of the day, and also you're a sex worker. So now all those intersectionalities, how do we design interventions to actually cater for all those different